Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar about doping in sports. My name is Sarah Spelt, and I'm an Associate Director in the BU Alumni Relations Office. Today's webinar is sponsored by the BU Alumni Association and is offered as part of our Live to Learn Alumni Education Program. Many of our educational programs are held on campus, but we also offer webinars because we want to connect with our alumni around the globe. And we have alumni and guests joining us from near and far today, with participants listening all across the U.S. in places like Idaho, Colorado, Maine, Virginia, and of course, Massachusetts. Today, we also want to extend a special welcome to any BU students or parents who have joined us online. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have some housekeeping notes. As you know by now, this webinar is being hosted on the Adobe Connect online meeting platform. If you experience any trouble with the audio or visual portions of this presentation, please contact Adobe Connect at 1-800-422-3623. Today's presentation is being recorded and will soon be available for viewing on the Boston University Alumni Association website, which is www.bu.edu/alumni. Our speaker today is very eager to answer any questions you have, and you are welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box you see located below the slide. And we hope to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, presenting today from San Diego, Mr. Mark Johnson. Mark is a sports writer and sports photographer. He has covered cycling and endurance sports as a writer and photographer since the 1980s. His work often focuses on the business of pro cycling, a topic that frequently intersects with that sport's long history of doping. Along with U.S. publications like VeloNews and Road, his work is published in Cycling Weekly in the UK, Velo in France, Ride, Cycling Review, and CyclingNews in Australia, as well as general interest publications including the Wall Street Journal. VeloPress published Jensens' first book, Argyle Armada, behind the scenes of the pro cycling life, in which Jensen was embedded for a year with the Garmin-Cervélo professional cycling team. A Category 2 road cyclist, Mark has also bicycled across the U.S. twice and competed in an Ironman triathlon. A graduate of the University of California, San Diego, the author also has an MA and PhD in English literature from Boston University. His other passion is surfing, which he does frequently from the home he shares with his wife and two sons in Del Mar, California. Mark, thank you again for being with us. I am going to pull up your slideshow, and the floor is yours.
All right, thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to this. Let's go and bring those slides up. And I'll say a few words about why I got interested in this topic of doping in sport. It really began with the year I spent with the Garmin-Cervélo cycling team, which was created by a guy named Jonathan Vaughters, who raced with Lance Armstrong on the U.S. Postal team. And Vaughters ended up quitting pro cycling because he was so fed up with the doping. And so then he came back to the United States and created a pro cycling team with the unlikely project of racing at the Tour de France level without doping, which, as we'll see in this presentation, was a very, very unorthodox approach to pro cycling, which has always embraced doping as really a career obligation for pro cyclists. So when I spent a year with that team, I became more interested in how did doping become demonized? Because really for the first 100 years of professional sports, doping was expected, it was often praised. And I was particularly curious about this topic as an American, where we celebrate and even advertise performance-enhancing drugs, whether it be amphetamines to address ADHD, Viagra to increase sexual performance, low T treatments for testosterone. We celebrate, advertise these performance-enhancing drugs as good things, but then we hold athletes up to a completely different set of standards. And that paradox was something that fascinated me, and is really what this book is about. So today we kind of assume that doping is an individual delinquency. Lance Armstrong's a bad guy, he cheated, he should be thrown out. And that is certainly the case, that he did cheat. The rules state you can't dope. But it's more than an issue of just individual athletes making bad decisions. It's really a collective achievement, which all of us, particularly as Americans, are part of, and that's what we're going to look at today. Looking back at the early professional sports and Olympic sports, doping really was not demonized. And a good example of that is the 1904 Olympic Marathon, which is in St. Louis, Missouri. And the guy who won it was an American, Thomas Lucas, who ended up winning the race with the assistance of strychnine. Although today we assume that strychnine is a rat killer. At the time, in small doses, strychnine can have a stimulating effect. And so he won this race with the assistance of brandy, egg whites, and strychnine. After the event, his coach and doctor, and also an official Olympic chronicler, wrote that drugs are of much benefit to athletes along the road. Charles Lucas, the doctor, really celebrated the fact that this American had embraced contemporary modern technology, pharmaceutical technology, to push the boundaries of human performance. And this is actually in the Olympic record today. You can pull this up from the Olympic website and see this Olympic celebration of the power of doping in sport. And that attitude really carried on through the 1940s. A good example of that is an exercise physiologist and strength training pioneer named Peter Karpovich. He did a fair amount of research on the effect of performance-enhancing drugs in sports. But he did not look at it as a moral issue. He was really looking at it as a clinician. And he argued that if you're using a substance or a device that improves your physical performance and it doesn't hurt your health, then it's unethical. Because in his opinion, and that of the majority of the medical community at the time, through the 1940s, if it's available to everyone and it's not hurting you, then it's no different than using any other materials, technology, or embracing the latest sports training techniques. So really, the sense that doping is categorically evil that we take for granted today is a relatively new phenomenon. And to understand this shift, we've got to step back to the beginnings of the Olympics. And the Olympics was created by a French aristocrat named Pierre de Coubertin, and it was sort of a brainstorm that he had in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. Really, he saw the rise of a powerful mercantile class, and also the rise of workers who were agitating for social revolution as a threat to the feudal order. And he envisioned in 1894 these International Olympic Games as a theater where he could preserve the gentlemanly class order that was being threatened. And the first Olympics were held in 1896. Coubertin saw the Olympics as an arena for an aristocracy, an elite, really gentlemen who did not have to work. And they even discouraged, it was seen as unseemly if you were training for your event, because that would suggest that you're taking a professional approach to it. And really, professionalism, not doping, was the main problem that the Olympics struggled with really well into the 20th century. And in fact, in 1912, because cycling was a professional sport, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, came out and said cycling should not be included in the Olympic Games because it was a professional sport. And it really stayed that way, this focus on keeping pros out of the Olympics. And we could see that when the IOC wrote its first anti-doping stricture in 1946. It wasn't so much that the IOC was against doping, it was that the IOC was against professionals who had always used dope to engage in their practices. So this sense of of moral indignation that we have against doping today is really a contemporary manifestation of the original IOC rejection of professionalism, which was seen as if you rode your bike or ran a marathon for money, that was an indication that you were morally inferior to the aristocracy who were practicing in the Olympics. And so over time, this rejection of professionalism sort of morphed into a rejection of doping. So when did this transition from relative indifference to doping or even celebration of doping transform into today's outright rejection of doping? Well, there's a couple signal events that started the medical community to question its indifference to doping. And probably the most signal event is the 1960 Rome Olympics. And in those games, it was held in the team time trial, which is when you have a team of cyclists ride. In this case, they rode 60 miles, and it was about 100 degrees. Knud Enemark Jensen on the Danish team, he ended up dying during the race. He died of heat stroke. He wasn't drinking much water. He fell off his bike, and the medical EMT people put him into a tent that was unfortunately unair conditioned, and he basically broiled in this tent for 2 hours and then succumbed and died. Today we know that heat stroke is very treatable. If someone's suffering from heat stroke, essentially your interior body temperature is rising, and the body starts to shut down various systems in order to compensate. To deal with that, basically you put someone in an ice bath and lower their core body temperature. But in 1960, they did the opposite. Instead of putting Jensen in an ice bath, they put him in a broiling oven until he died. Now, what does this have to do with doping? After this happened, the press got wind that Enemark Jensen had taken amphetamines. Later research, the medical investigation found that there was no evidence that he had amphetamines in his system, and in fact he had died from bad medical care and heat stroke. But that wasn't the story that took root. The notion of drugs killing this heroic athlete was much more salacious. It was of more interest to both the press and readers, and so that's the myth that took hold. And because of this death, the medical community started to take a new look at its relative indifference to doping in sport, even though there's no evidence that drugs had anything to do with Jensen's death. And this is a signal event in the history of doping in sport because it really marks a transition in how the sports medicine community looked at doping. You could really say that the medicines started to get sacerdotal. They started to take on the role of priests who were not only concerned with an athlete's physical health, but now concerned with his and her moral health. And it's a very fundamental and radical conversion in how the medical community looked at doping in sport. As a result of Jensen's death in 1960, the Council of Europe, which is a pan-European organization that sprung up after World War II, held a series of doping conferences where the medical community said, all right, let's look at this tradition, which is 100 years old, because pro cycling started in the 1860s, 1870s. With the Industrial Revolution, that's when people could start to make money as an athlete. So you have this 100-year-old tradition, and these conferences started to question it. Ludwig Prokop was a very esteemed European sport doctor. He was the head of the University of Vienna's Institute for Sports Sciences, and he was a IOC, International Olympic Committee member who attended 26 Olympics. When he was at the 1954 Innsbruck Games, he was alarmed by the number of syringes he saw in the athletes' locker rooms. And this, along with Jensens' death in 1960, really provoked him to take a harder look at doping. And he said, quote, "Doping must be regarded primarily as a sporting and not a medical program." So there you can see the shift away from, on the part of the medical community, away from looking at doping as a technical, administrative medical problem to a problem of ethics in sport. The governments also got involved with doping in the 1960s. France and Belgium made doping a crime in 1965. Why? The French were concerned because they saw the athletes as being exploited by indifferent exploitative managers, sponsors, and race organizers. So it was really a paternalistic effort to try and protect pro cyclists from exploitation at the hands of their employers. And the laws are really focused at the doctors and the team managers who are administering doping more than the athletes who are doping themselves. This concern about doping also accelerated in 1967 when a British rider named Tom Simpson died at the Tour de France while riding a famous climb called Mountain Ventoux. In his case, there was no question that drugs were involved. He had succumbed to heat stroke that was definitely accelerated by amphetamines and alcohol. So in 1968, the IOC introduced its first drug tests, and in 1975, the IOC created a medical commission, basically pulled the matter of doping, which up until 1975 had been a subset of rules that you need to follow to maintain your amateur status. They pulled it from how to maintain your amateurism and developed a whole separate set of medical rules to address the issue of doping. So that's really when doping started to formally move away from doping as an act that professionals do to doping is in itself wrong. That really in the 1960s, the mid 70s is when we see this big shift. Now, it wasn't only sports that was changing our attitudes towards doping in sport. There were a couple other events that created larger social anxieties that started to get us to question our attitudes towards drugs as a life-enhancing procedure, methodology, and something you should embrace. Probably the most important thing is the thalidomide disaster. This was a drug that was introduced in 1957, and it was used to treat morning sickness and help pregnant mothers sleep. Unfortunately, it ended up causing over 10,000 birth defects in children. It was not because of one hero in the United States and the FDA. It was not ever introduced in the United States. But when the public started to see these photographs in newspapers of children being born with these horrifying birth defects, we started to question our relatively benign attitudes towards drugs that up until then were seen as fairly miraculous. In other words, the same drugs that could solve and stop the disfiguring horrors of polio could create a whole new set of human horrors. And so that social anxiety about that started to question our attitudes towards drugs started to bleed into sports as well. Of course, this is the 1960s. There were also pretty terrific counterculture and anxieties about hippies smoking pot, dropping acid. And in fact, in 1969, Sports Illustrated ran a 3-part series on the problem of drugs in sport. This piece was clearly a reflection of the times. This is when Richard Nixon was presenting drug use as a threat to the silent majority. He called, in 1970, he called drug abuse in America a national emergency. He associated it with, quote, a rising tide of terrorism. And in 1970, Nixon signed the Drug Abuse and Control Act, which created the schedules of drugs that we have today. So these countercultural anxieties also fed into our changing attitudes towards doping in sport. And in my book, I even talk about in California in October of 1970, the California state legislators held a hearing on the problem of doping in high school sports. And it's fairly fascinating to read how these legislators make an express connection between their sense that hippies smoking pot was going to degrade the overall performance of the nation, and how athletes who had also embraced drugs in their sports, how that might also affect the moral health of California's high school athletes. So you've got social anxieties about drug use. You've got a growing medical community concern about the health and moral complications that come with drug use in sport. And these start to coagulate as the anti-doping bureaucracy and forces that we take for granted today. Everything sounds like it's good. We're going to start to reject drugs in sport. However, what else is happening in the 1960s? The Cold War. In 1957, Soviet Union sent up Sputnik, the first satellite. This was hugely alarming in the United States. It felt like we were being dropped by the communists. And sports became an extension of the Cold War. And I think probably the most dramatic exhibition of this was at the 1959 World Basketball Championships in Santiago, Chile. The Soviet Union beat the U.S. 62-37. The New York Times wrote a piece basically excoriating the United States for letting the communists beat us at the sport that we had invented. The Times wrote, when it comes to shooting at the moon or a basket, the United States cannot keep up with Russia. So what you start to see happening is that sports becomes a way to exert international presence, to try and basically win the war of capitalism versus communism by suggesting that U.S. sports teams, capitalist sports teams, are morally superior and physically superior to the Soviet system. Well, when we lose in our own game, that started to question that whole premise. So this was a concern to American legislators and also to the presidential office. In 1960, John F. Kennedy wrote a piece in Sports Illustrated questioning America's lack of physical fitness. Part of this came from a report that showed that 57% of American kids were failing a basic fitness test, that compared to only 8.7% of European kids failing a fitness test. Also, an alarming number of recruits, military recruits in the United States, didn't have the basic fitness required to join the military. So JFK basically took Americans to task for being fat and lazy. And it was seen as a threat to our military preparedness. Because mind you, the sense at the time was that we could be called to arms at any minute to fight with the Soviet Union. And the fact that half of the nation was not ready to fight was seen as a real menace to our physical and moral and military health. So those of you who are old enough to remember doing the presidential physical fitness tests when in elementary school, you were really part of a military preparation effort. And this was a system that was put together where elementary school kids would have to run a mile, do a certain number of push-ups, sit-ups, and if you met these standards, and you would get this Presidential Physical Fitness Award. This sense of dread and fear of the Soviet Union also hit the pages of Life magazine, which is really one of the most well-read magazines, and it went straight to middle America. In '66, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president at the time, said that Russian sport is a challenge to us, just like Sputnik was. We're going to be humiliated as a nation unless we start to develop better U.S. sporting teams. Meanwhile, fast forward to the 1970s in East Germany. East Germany took this very seriously. They saw the Olympic playing field as a way to satisfy two goals. One was to assert their independence and superiority in the face of the hated occupying Russians. And it was a way for them to assert the superiority of their system against the hated capitalist system. And in 1968, for instance, the East German Minister of Sport said that Olympic preparation is no different than any military conflict. And it was seen as like mission control when you send an astronaut into space. So East Germany created this state plan, Subject 1425, that basically militarized the preparation of their Olympic teams. There were 1,500 sports science researchers working with East German Olympians, 1,000 doctors, 4,700 coaches, and also there were 3,000 Stasi Secret Service agents making sure that these doctors and coaches were towing the line and doing what they're supposed to do, which included administering 2 million doses of anabolic steroids every year to athletes. Now, this system worked. And in Montreal in 1976, East Germany and the USSR took home 89 gold medals. The USA took home 34. In our bicentennial year, this was hugely embarrassing. It was pathetic. Overall, USSR and GDR took 215 medals compared to our 89. Meanwhile, East Germany had a population of 17 million, and they took 40 golds, where we had 220 million. So, So doping worked, but it's important to keep in mind that doping wasn't all doping. Really what the East Germans, and to a lesser extent the Soviets, were designing by focusing the efforts of their material scientists, their medical community, physical therapists, psychologists, was the foundation of the marginal gain systems that we take for granted today in elite sport, where essentially what you're doing is creating a context where every athlete's need from nutrition, sleep, recovery, medicine, training, they created the notion of periodized training where you have heavy workloads, then going down to lower workloads in order to recover. All of this was created in the context of the Cold War as a way to celebrate the superiority of the communist systems. And although we take it for granted today, these systems came out of the Cold War. So, we get humiliated in Montreal in 1976. The executive branch put together a commission on Olympic sports to try and analyze what we could do to stop this problem of humiliation on the Olympic and international playing field by communists. And what we came up with is the Amateur Sports Act of 1978. And Gerald Ford, then vice president for another month or so, wrote a piece in Sports Illustrated arguing that we are going to improve the U.S. Olympic program. However, because Ford was a Republican and had a natural aversion to heavy top-down state-funded programs, he said, this isn't going to be a program that's modeled after the Soviet Union or the East Germans. It's going to be at minimal cost to the taxpayer. So you've got a system. We've said we're going to reform our Olympic committees. We're going to create winning athletes, but we're not going to use taxpayer dollars to pull this off. How are we going to do it? The test came, originally the test was going to come in Moscow in 1980, but we boycotted the Soviet Union's Olympics because they had invaded Afghanistan. So the real test of this Amateur Sports Act was pushed out to 1984 in Los Angeles. This is where we're going to see how does our revised Olympic system going to pay off. And the pressure was really on the U.S. Olympic Committee going into Los Angeles. One example of this is in 1983, President Ronald Reagan met with the head honchos of the U.S. Olympic Committee. And he said, I know we won't let those kids down and you won't shortchange our country. A week later, he met with a group of Christian evangelicals in Florida, and he said it is an American obligation to resist the impulses of the evil empire that is the Soviet Union. Simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is not folly. Now, put yourself in the shoes of these Olympic Committee officials. They didn't know the full extent, but they knew that the East Germans and the Soviets had this massive state-funded doping program. Reagan isn't saying go dope, but he's saying don't disappoint us, don't embarrass us. That puts the American Olympic organizers in a really tough situation. How do they deal with what seemed to be an untenable situation where the rules say you can't dope, but the higher national obligation said do what it takes to win? Well, the one example of how we dealt with this on the case of one Olympic body was the U.S. cycling team. Blood doping, it was a long-used procedure in pro cycling and amateur cycling, where essentially what you do is you would take your blood out, store it, and then before a big event, you would introduce blood back into your body. What does this do? It gives you more red blood cells, more oxygen carrying capacity, and it really improves your performance in endurance events. The USA cycling coaches looked at this procedure and in fact sent out a letter in 1983 saying this procedure seems to work. I think we should use it for the 84 games. The U.S. Cycling Federation president told Sports Illustrated in 1985 we weren't going to fall behind the Russians or East Germans anymore. Now, from our perspective today in 2017, we can look back at this U.S. cycling team's embrace of blood doping and say, oh, that's immoral, that's wrong. But I think that is imposing today's set of standards on the mid-1980s, where the Cold War had really infused everything with a sense of maybe we need to suspend our subscription to some of the nascent anti-doping standards in order to fulfill our larger international and patriotic obligations. So the U.S. cycling team used blood doping. They did very well, and it worked. Now, Los Angeles, in addition to these Cold War issues, there was one other problem or factor that was coming into play that was complicating the efforts of the relatively new anti-doping bureaucrats and enforcers. And that is the fact that the Olympics are really expensive to hold. And a good example of this was Montreal in 1996. In 1976, was sold to the citizens of Quebec. It's going to cost them $310 million. In fact, it cost over $3 billion and was not paid off until 2006. Going into the 84 Olympics, the citizens of the United States, and more specifically Los Angeles, knew this, and they didn't want to get screwed by the International Olympic Committee. This was acutely the case in California because in June of 1978, an anti-tax campaigner named Howard Jarvis helped pass a Proposition 13, which capped property taxes. And really what this reflected is a very strong anti-tax current that was flowing through California and the United States. So, let's put this in context. You've got Reagan saying, don't disappoint us. You've got a new federal system put in place that says we're going to win on the Olympic playing field, but we're not going to do it using a big government, overarching government body, and so they're not going to take taxpayers' dollars. Going into Los Angeles in 1984, and in November of 1978, sort of on the heels of Proposition 13, the citizens of Los Angeles passed a local referendum making it illegal to use any of their taxpayer dollars to pay for the Olympics. This was in response to the Montreal debacle. So, the U.S. Olympic Committee hired a guy named Peter Ueberroth, who was a business genius who had made a ton of money in the travel agency business, and he was charged with putting on these successful games without using any taxpayer dollars. How does he do this? He used really good negotiating skills to basically wring a lot of money out of sponsors and television networks. So, for instance, he had no working capital to start the games, to start planning the games. So what did he do? He demanded that television networks fork over a $750,000 deposit before they could sit at the table to start negotiating over who was going to get the eventual contract. In 78, 76, when this is all going on, 79, interest rates in the United States were close to 20%. So he was all of a sudden bringing in almost $1,000 a day just in interest. And so then he started to have the working capital to develop the games. He ended up signing a contract for $225 million with ABC. That was larger than the television contracts for all previous Olympics combined. Another good example of his savvy negotiating skills was Kodak had been the long-time supporter of the Olympics. They were the official film supplier. Well, what Ueberroth had set up a deal. He said, if you're going to be a sponsor, you have to make an in-kind donation to a nonprofit organization, which would then later support inner-city and youth programs, sporting programs in Los Angeles. Well, Kodak got the $4 million deal to be the sponsor, but they lagged on making their in-kind donation. So Ueberroth went to Fuji and said, hey, you guys want to be the film sponsor? And Fuji said, sure we do. He went back to Kodak and said, all right, you guys either make your in-kind donation or you're in breach of contract. Kodak laughed it off, and he knocked them out and made Fuji the official film sponsor for $7 million instead of $4 million. He ended up making a profit. The Olympic Games in Los Angeles eventually made a profit of over $232 million, which was unheard of and remains unheard of for the Olympic Games. Now, one of the problems is when you have to support your Olympic Games, by pleasing corporate sponsors, doping scandals are something that no one wants. And doping was going to be a problem in the '84 Olympics. And that became acutely, Olympic organizers became acutely aware of this in 1983 when at the Pan American Games in Caracas, Venezuela, 15 athletes tested positive in the first few days of the games because HP had invented some new anti-doping machines that could identify the presence of steroids weeks after they had been administered. So when this happened, when all these athletes tested positive, 12 American track and field athletes left Caracas before they even competed. They didn't even put a cleat on the field because presumably they knew that if they got tested, they were going to come up positive. I think a good example of the American athletes' attitude towards this was a quote that from U.S. Olympic long jumper Willie White in the New York Times in '76 said, "If we're going to compete against synthetic athletes, we must become synthetic athletes." And the United States athletes were taking drugs to try and compete with them. Sorry about the illegibility of this. Ubroff said in 1983, he wrote to then IOC President Juan Antonio Samaranch, that drugs and doctors are not only controlling the games of the Olympiad, they're beginning to gain control of the whole Olympic movement. He really saw this burgeoning anti-drug mission and the missionaries as a threat to his obligation to the taxpayers of Los Angeles not to use their money, because he had to please the corporate sponsors and the television networks to deliver accessible games. And when you're throwing athletes out of the games, or when they're packing up and going home before the games even start, that is not pleasing to your television sponsors and the television networks. So, what did LA do? In advance of the games, they used a drug testing lab that had been set up at UCLA to test American athletes before the games. Of the 86 American athletes who tested positive before the '84 Olympic Games, 84 of them went on to compete. And you say, well, how could we let these athletes compete even though they had tested positive? Well, the reason was they weren't official tests, and they were really just screening tests to help the athletes make sure that all the drugs were out of their system before they competed. Because the LA organizing committee wanted to avoid the same sort of embarrassing scandal that had inflamed Caracas. So that was the first step to try and keep drug scandals out of the '84 Olympic Games. But it continued on through the end of the games. The last week of the games was when most of the track and field events were held. And a whole bunch of positive tests were coming across the drug testing bench at UCLA. When the drug testing administrators at UCLA went with a list of positives, and the way it works is that you test an athlete's blood or urine blindly. It's just a number on a beaker, so that protects both it protects both the athlete and the drug tester from accusations of bias. So, drug testing lab comes up with, all right, these are all the numbers that have been positive. They went to the IOC medical director, who maintained a list of the numbers that connected to the names, and he said, same as Alexander Road, said, oh, I can't find it, it's gone missing. So even though you had all these positive tests, they weren't able to identify or connect those positives with people. And of the 20 American athletes who medaled at the '84 Olympics, they all still have their medals. Of the 20 athletes who medaled and were positive, they all still have their medals because that spreadsheet was lost. So this is another example of how the U.S. Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee foiled the efforts of the anti-doping programs in order to protect the Olympic athletes and to make sure, protect not the athletes, but protect the Olympic Games and the sponsors to make sure that the Games were successful. So to recap, you've got anti-doping, bureaucracies, changing attitudes towards doping in sport that built to the 60s and 70s. The 84 Olympics, the IOC begins to realize that there's enormous wealth, unlocked wealth in the Olympic Games. And that sense that the Olympics is a celebration of not just athletes, but of corporations who had to be enlisted in order for the Olympic Games to go off in 84, those commercial pressures really worked very strongly against the anti-doping measures that were going on. And also, you have the issues of the Cold War and geopolitical interests that are an even more powerful effort that is subverting the efforts of the anti-doping industry. So hopefully you can see from those two examples, both geopolitical issues and the sponsorship issues with the Olympics, how the anti-doping efforts really didn't stand a chance, particularly in the context of the Cold War. And so doping isn't just a matter of athletes making bad choices. It's a matter of athletes making choices, but also governments, corporations, and taxpayers saying we need to minimize doping scandals in order to put on these entertainment events. So, where are we today? Is there less doping in sport? Maybe. The World Anti-Doping Agency did a study in 2013, and they found that of athletes who are doping, we're probably only catching 2% of them. And if you throw out the positive dope tests for marijuana and asthma medicines, we're probably catching less than 1% of athletes who are doping. What does that mean? Does that mean that 99% of athletes are clean? No way. It just means that it's relatively difficult to catch athletes, and it's pretty easy to avoid the dope tests. Even though the Cold War has ended, many of these geopolitical pressures persist. And I think that wasn't made any clearer than at the Rio Olympics, where it became clear through a World Anti-Doping Agency investigation that the Soviet Union had both been systematically doping their athletes, but also Sochi Olympics had put together a program to expressly foil the efforts of the anti-doping agencies to try and find their athletes. And that actually continued when one of the Soviet Union's efforts to try and minimize the damage from the scandal that broke out in Rio was to hack into the World Anti-Doping Agency's databases and find information on American and British athletes who had used what's called therapeutic use exemptions, which is basically you get a doctor's permission to use banned drugs. And it's a gray area because just because you're an athlete doesn't mean you suspend your right to medical care. But it's also an area that's rife for abuse because all it takes is a team doctor to say, yeah, let's invent a malady so that you can get this banned drug. So that was another effort that the Soviet Union used to try and say, well, we're not alone in doping. Everybody's doing it. I included this picture of Lance Armstrong, who's really sort of the poster boy for doping abuse. And he illustrates the fact that commercial interests still remain a very potent force working against the efforts of anti-doping. Lance Armstrong was on the cover of Sports Illustrated 11 times. Muhammad Ali was on the cover 37 times. Michael Jordan was on the cover 57 times. The editor of Outside Magazine said in 2015 that Lance Armstrong was the most bankable cover subject Outside had ever seen this side of Mount Everest. In 1999, when Armstrong came back to cycling and won his first Tour de France, there were a lot of rumors that he was doping, which was not surprising considering that doping has always been part of pro cycling. Why would he be any different than this long-held tradition? But there were also tremendous financial interests and so interested that on the part of the U.S. cycling to minimize these scandals because he was doing so much good for the sport and all its attendant commercial interests. So, where are we today? Some could say things have changed, but you could also argue, particularly based on what happened in the Soviet Union, that nothing has changed at all. So, to wrap it up, I think when you read about the next doping scandal, whether it be an individual athlete or complicity on the part of an entire nation, it's important to keep in mind that doping is in fact a group achievement. It's not just a solitary delinquency. And also keep in mind that this notion that particularly professional sport has a pedagogical obligation to teach us to be better people is really a long-term hangover from Pierre de Coubertin's effort to create the Olympics as a school for gentlemen, a preserve of the feudal order. The essence of professional sports is to make money and entertain. That is objective number one. And number two, the conditioning effects that come with being an athlete. It's developing a sense of courage, commitment to training, your ability to follow through on tasks. Yes, those are very good values that we attain through pro sports, but they aren't the essence of pro sports. And so once you understand that, you start to see that this anti-doping project is up to some very, very significant barriers. And it's really a quest for sort of state of chivalric sporting purity that has never really existed. But it's a hope in the unseen. It's a hope that maybe someday we can move to this state. I interviewed Travis Tygart, who was the head of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency when I was writing this book. And I asked him, I said, is it ever frustrating to you that you're the head of an anti-doping agency, which, by the way, wasn't created until 2000, 35 years after France and Belgium banned doping? Indicates sort of the United States or the laissez-faire attitudes towards doping in sport. But I asked him, I said, does it ever frustrate you the fact that we advertise performance-enhancing drugs on television and you are trying to create this subset that rejects that fundamental American right to dope ourselves into better lives? And he said it's incredibly frustrating, but it's also invigorating because he feels like his job to try and create this drug-free bubble in the midst of a drug-soaked society makes his project even more worthwhile and worth pursuing. So I want to open it up here to questions. Feel free to let me know anything else if you want to ask more questions about the Soviet Union, what's going on there. This is the book. You can get it on Amazon. It's any bookstore. It's available in digital and print. And there's some of my social media handles too. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Yes, Mark, thank you so much. If anyone has a question, you can type it into the box that you see below the slides. So go ahead and do that, and I can read them out loud for Mark to answer. And also, in the meantime, I can put a plug in for this book because I actually just finished reading it this morning as I was drinking my protein shake, of course. Mark, it's great. I learned a ton, and you helped reinforce that knowledge with your wonderful presentation, so thank you.
One of the questions I always get is, so you've written this book, you've illustrated how difficult it is to stop doping in sport, the enormous political and commercial interests that are working against the Doping Missionaries Project, should we just open it up and make drugs legal? Kind of go in the directions that American society has gone in general with our embrace of performance-enhancing drugs for society at large. And I don't think that's a good idea. And one of the main reasons I don't think that's a good idea is because I don't think a 17-year-old kid who identifies their talent and love for cycling or swimming or triathlon or baseball should have to say, all right, in order to pursue this passion and this love, I'm going to have to enlist a doctor. Or because when you're 17, you don't have enough money to hire a doctor, I'm going to have to go on the street and buy these drugs illegally. I don't think that's a good direction to go into. So that's one of the strongest reasons why I think that just opening up doping drugs, letting sportsmen take whatever drugs they want is a bad idea.
Well, and what is the best way for people to sort of follow this issue and get information? Because it seems like it's very, very difficult for people to speak openly and honestly about it. It seems like people, they have to follow a political line or a corporate line, or, as athletes, they're role models. So it's very difficult, it seems like, for people to discuss honestly. Where's the best way to get, information?
Well, I think that the New York Times does a pretty good job of covering doping. The World Anti-Doping Agency, you could follow them on Instagram. They're going to spout the party line, but they've also been, as this research they did in 2013 showed, they're pretty open about stating the difficulty of their project. Of course, I'm going to tout my own horn here, but I would read this book. It's going to give you a much more comprehensive understanding. In this book, I don't just talk about cycling. I cover Major League Baseball and how essential drugs were to the resurrection of Major League Baseball after the strike in 1994. Fans weren't going to games. Steroids brought fans back because steroids helped athletes hit a lot of home runs. And, the Mark McGwire-Sammy Sosa home run battle in the 90s really revitalized baseball. And Major League Baseball didn't want to do anything about the doping problem because it was bad for business. Now, in the book, I also talk about how Major League Baseball had a very big congressional assist because at the same time, in the 90s, we passed Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, which basically removed any government oversight from the supplement industry and allowed the supplement industry to sell steroids over the counter at Walmart, Target, GNC to teenagers who wanted to emulate Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire. And so while our congressmen and legislators might rail against doping in sport, we're also have created some very, very big loopholes for the supplement industry to sell some really contaminated bad stuff to American youth. So it's another example that I cover in the book of how we're really complicit with the encouragement of the use of the same drugs that we love to condemn.
We have just about a minute left, but we had a quick question and a recommendation. One of our participants recommended following anything by Frank Shorter. And then we also had a question. If you are a diabetic bike racer on insulin, why do you need to get a test every year? I think it's a test. I think there might be a typo there, but does that make sense?
I don't know the regulations around insulin use in cycling. I'm not sure about that one.
Okay. Something to do further research on. Now, if we don't have any additional questions, first, Mark, I want to thank you for taking time to share all of your work in this book, your research with your fellow terriers. And thank you to all of you for joining us on this webinar. And I want to invite all of you to join us next month. We have an educational webinar on February 15th about bullying with two professors from our School of Education. You can find information about that at bu.edu/alumni/events. Mark, thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks so much. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, just shoot me an email. I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. Have a great
All right. Thanks so much for hosting me.
Of course.